This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo, just back from 3.5 weeks in the U.S. In addition to visiting friends and family, I recorded a lot of comics interviews, which you're going to be hearing here over the next few months. The interviews were recorded mainly in Minneapolis, Columbus, and Portland. I'll be shaking up the chronology on them a bit because some of the episodes are a bit time-sensitive. This week, my talk with Ted Anderson, one of the writers of IDW's My Little Pony series. This was one of several interviews I did at the World Monster Headquarters studio in Minneapolis, the same studio where I interviewed Xander Cannon in 2014 when it was known as Big Time Attic. There'll be more from World Monster Headquarters creators in a future episode. Ted and I talked about My Little Pony and what makes it so popular, his approach to writing for kids, and more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. Okay, now I'm talking with Ted Anderson. How you doing?
Hello, I'm good to be here. Glad to be here. Good to meet you.
So now you're exclusively a writer, right?
That's right. I am just a writer, as they say. I have a couple of business cards from other people in my position who specifically say their name and their job title is another writer guy or something along those lines. I think that's a good way to sum it up. Yeah.
So what for you? What's the utility of being plugged into a studio like this? You're not sitting here doing art.
That's true. I mean, I consider myself sort of an adjunct member of World Monster Headquarters. I'm not technically part of the studio. I don't pay studio dues. Mm-hmm. I drop by once a week. We get pizza and we, talk shop. That's kind of about it when it comes to my actual studio presence. Mm-hmm. Because writing, of course, I can do anywhere. I once wrote part of a script while waiting in line at Chipotle. It's great. I love having a phone that can do that. I love being able to just toss off script lines. I don't know. I consider myself part of World Monster, though, just because I'm friends with all the people here, and we're all sort of in vaguely the same wheelhouse of doing interesting, original, unique, personally meaningful, strange works that can't easily be quantified. Which I guess in the comics world boils down to not superheroes. But, some of us even done some of that. But, it boils down to us. Everyone in World Monster has sort of a very personal take on the work that we do. Which means that we don't really have much in common with each other except our oddities. That's not a bad slogan. Nothing in common with each other except our oddities.
Okay. Now, so how long have you been, writing? Were you writing stories as a kid?
I was, yeah. I definitely, I actually just a couple weeks ago, I dug up some ancient floppy disks from my dad's old office, and they had samples of my writing from high school on them. And I'm not sharing those anymore, I tell you that. But no, I was always interested in constructing narratives, putting words together. I don't know exactly what drew me to comics, particularly since I can't do half of what comics is. I don't draw well enough to be able to illustrate what's in my head, which means that I'm kind of coming out of the starting gate with one leg broken. Mm-hmm. At the same time, that means I can work with interesting people and sort of get their perspectives and make use of their particularly interesting drawing styles and stuff like that to try and to bring a vision to life. But it means that I'm kind of fighting with a handicap.
Well, there are a lot of comics writers like that. Alan Moore gave up drawing.
Oh, that's
Brian
true.
Michael Bendis gave up drawing.
Yeah. Look where it got them. Yeah. Hey, everybody, for aspiring comics creators, give up drawing now. Yeah. I don't know. I like the format. I like the medium quite a lot. That's really what it boils down to. I grew up reading comics. My parents were not big comics people, but I, for some reason, latched onto them a lot. Something that it's sort of an interesting this probably had an effect on my love for the medium. But when I was in second grade, my father got a Fulbright fellowship to teach film history classes in Norway, in Oslo, Norway, and the whole family moved out to Norway for 7 months. Me, second grade, American-born kid, moving out to Norway, and I learned some Norwegian. I learned enough to be conversational, and about half of what I learned was because I would pick up issues of Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge and stuff like that at the local newsstand. Because for some reason, I don't entirely know why, but for some reason, all the classic Disney stuff is still insanely popular in Scandinavian countries. Like the issues that would come out would be like half classic Don Rosa, Carl Barks stories, and then half new stuff, on all of it translated into Norwegian. And it's a phenomenal way to learn the language. Like, you can learn a whole bunch of interesting stuff, and like sentence construction and just conversational phrases from comics, because as a medium, half of it is completely universal. Apart from that, I don't know. I mean, professionally, I had been trying to break into comics for some time. I wrote scripts and ideas through all of high school and into college. And what got me into comics professionally was networking and a lucky break. I was a big fan of the My Little Pony TV series, the new version, My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic, Generation 4, if you want to get specific about your My Little Pony generations. Because, see, Generation 1 was... No, I'm not going to go into detail.
Well, I wanted to ask about My Little Pony, because, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the first My Little Pony. I mean, it was too young for me, because I'm old. But it was... my younger sister, I think, was kind of interested in the 80s.
Oh, yeah. When that first movie came out, with the voices of, among others, Tony Randall and Danny DeVito, let's not forget. When that first movie came out, I mean, that was, I think, the year before I was born. Or maybe the same year. I was born in 85. I think that came out in 84. Okay. And I was aware of it as a toy property growing up. I think my sister had one of the dolls, but didn't pay it any particular attention. I was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was DuckTales. I was, what else was I? the Disney Afternoon Channel, the Chippendales Rescue Rangers, Tailspin, those shows instead. My Little Pony existed. I had zero knowledge of it. Just kind of disparagingly dismissing it as, oh, that's girl stuff,
Well, I guess at the time it was basically just a vehicle to sell toys, right?
It was, and to some degree still is, as many of America's most hallowed franchises are.
Sure.
I mean, G.I. Joes and Transformers. That's the mandate right there. Yeah, I mean, it was. It was, to the best of my knowledge, I've done a little research into the origin of the whole franchise. Bonnie Zakarl, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. The credited as the creator of the franchise, came to it as an idea of doing a toy and a story to go with it, and a world to go with it, basically. And it kind of grew out of there. And yeah, there was toys every step of the way, and there still very much are. They're spoiling plot points for the new upcoming movie by the toys that are coming out right now. It's a little bit disappointing when there are these great shocking twists in the upcoming movie that are completely spoiled by the fact that you can buy the characters on any Target shop shelf.
Comics is used to that. Diamond Preview spoils everything.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, hey, Secret Wars came out because Marvel did a survey, and the two most popular words for toy tie-ins were secret and war. I love that fact. I mean, that fact right there, that just speaks to the mindset of Marvel and, well, Marvel in general, I guess. Well, any comics company, let's be fair. But yeah, I mean, the show had essentially zero impact on me up until the age of... up until the year 2011, let's say.
There was a big hiatus there, wasn't there?
There was. Again, I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head. Well, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a hiatus so much as there have been sort of major generational pushes.
Yeah, I meant to look it up, and I didn't get around to it.
It's a nightmare. it's the same. I mean, if you think about it, it's been going for probably about as long as Transformers, and has had as many sort of reboots and incarnations and different versions along the way, and had different, celebrity tie-ins here and there. I don't think My Little Pony ever had Orson Welles do a voice, but I wouldn't have been surprised. But it's the same kind of thing where there have been sort of 8.5 different versions of these characters, and this character had 6 names, and there have been these variant spin-offs and that sort of thing. To the best of my knowledge, the show there have existed multiple My Little Pony shows up until the current one. Some of them were direct-to-video movies, and some of them were on odd cable channels and stuff like that. But it's always existed in some form or another. And essentially, what happened is someone pretty well known and with a very clear artistic vision got a hold of it. In this case, Lauren Faust, who was I don't remember her exact position. She was one of the major players on the Powerpuff Girls, and then later on Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, and she brought a lot of life to those. And from what I understand of it, again, I'm kind of going off of what I've heard third hand, but she was talking with Hasbro about some other idea of hers, and they're like, hey, would you like to come on and do something new with My Little Pony? And she's like, well, heck, sure. So she spearheaded essentially this newest version of it, which is what's called Generation 4, or My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. And yeah, it's. I'm not going to try and sell anyone on it, but it's good. I like it. I mean, what I loved about it was that going into it, I knew, oh, this is being handled by someone who has a very proven track record. I mean, Powerpuff Girls and Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, they're dang solid shows. I still love those shows. Mm-hmm. And going into My Little Pony, knowing, oh, they have some good people on this, and expecting good kids television, and that's exactly what it is. It's great kids television, and I got into it. And I got into it when being a brony was not yet a bad word, but I really enjoyed it from the start, and I thought it was a great show. And essentially what happened is I got into the show, and then somewhere along the line I realized, hey, this is popular enough, they're probably going to be making a comic out of it. Because this is also around the time, I think, that Boom Studios had started putting out the Adventure Time comic, which, of course, started selling like gangbusters and still is selling like gangbusters. And I realized, somebody is going to have the license to this to start making comics of it. And this might be my chance to get in on the ground floor of something big. And kind of what I did, I hooked up with a friend of mine who makes webcomics, and she and I did sort of a sample page and a half of a comic. And I looked into the two major companies that I thought at the time had the likeliest chance of getting the license, which would be Boom, just because it was so big, or IDW, because they had all the other Hasbro licenses. They had Transformers and G.I. Joe. And so I talked to Xander Cannon, who I'm friends with, and he has worked for every comics company on the planet. And I just said, do you know anyone at IDW? And he's like, yeah, sure, I can put you in the right direction. So he put me in touch with somebody he knew, and they put me in touch with the guy who's handling the pony stuff, because, of course, by that point I knew, oh, they've got the pony license. And they're like, yeah, send us some samples. And I sent them some samples, and I sent them some pitches. And they're like, yeah, okay, here's an issue. Do what you can with it. And that was essentially how I broke into the comics industry, on a really hot new title on one of the most popular, hottest licenses of the time, which is a little bit astonishing looking back on it, but it worked. I mean, it's one of those not unlikely, but it's one of those things that can only happen through networking, persistence, and sheer luck.
Yeah. Yeah, right place at the right time.
Yeah.
So, now, are there many, little boys who watch My Little Pony? It still looks to me like mainly a girl-focused thing.
Well, I mean, that's a question that I don't know if it's ever been solidly answered. There have been a couple attempts to sort of survey the fandom, but, I mean, there's a distinct difference between the fandom and the audience. I mean, there's a way to measure, the people who come to the cons and who do fanfic or are really invested in sort of the extra canonical works like the comics and stuff like that. But we're still relying on things like Nielsen ratings for the actual viewing. I don't know, to be honest. I honestly have no idea what sort of the viewing proportion of it is, of boys versus girls, or what ages, or geographic location, or any other factor. I honestly don't know. I know that there's enough of a male audience that it's big. I know that there's enough of an audience in general that it's big.
Well, a lot of the male audience, of course, is the adult male audience.
There's that. I feel like
what the appeal there is either.
I mean, a lot of the vocal audience is the adult male audience. I mean, I still think this is one of those things where there's a portion of the fandom that is much more able to express itself, or is at least much more able to be visible, simply by virtue of its age. I mean, there may be a whole lot more 6-year-old fans, for example, but it's harder for them to post things online about how much they like the show. It's harder for them to, make websites or fan fiction or anything like that. I'm thinking, I don't really have any empirical evidence for it, but I think it's one of those tip of the iceberg type things where it's just that there's a certain proportion of the fandom that's more able to make itself visible. And if you counted up all the people in the world who like and watch My Little Pony, it's probably a lot more widespread. As to why there's this fandom in the adult male category in general. I mean, speaking only for myself, again, I like Lauren Faust's other work, and it's a show that there's a very fine line in writing for kids and then in writing for the whole family, and being able to produce a show that is enjoyable no matter what your mental age is. And a lot of it comes down to not being embarrassed by what you're producing, not coming across at the tone of like, oh, we have to make this dumb storyline for the kids, but trying to make a storyline that works and is clear and is resonant no matter your age and no matter how many times it's been done before, or there's been variations on it or things like that. Mm-hmm. It's an extremely delicate art. Not a lot of shows, I think, can do it well. I think there are a lot of other shows that do it well that maybe not have gotten the same level of attention. And I don't know whether that's because of people like Lauren Faust being involved or whether it's just this was the one that came at the right moment at the right time to suddenly have this flood of wild popularity.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I understand that this iteration of My Little Pony, they put more kind of thought into the world building and the continuity of it compared to the first one.
I'd say so. I mean, they've gone crazy outside their world building, and even from the first season, they've added new races and new countries and things like that. There's a level of detail to it that, I'll be honest, I don't actually know to what degree that's true of the previous generations, because I didn't watch them, and I still haven't really watched all that much myself of the earlier generations. I'd be curious as to how much of a world they developed in those previous seasons. A series of seasons, however you want to term them. I honestly don't know. It's a good question. I think that there may be I think that there's a portion of the fandom that sort of underestimates or dismisses a lot of the earlier stuff just because it was very much a show for little girls, and that still has something of a stigma, even among fans of a show that's still for little girls. Because let's also be honest here, this is still a show for young female viewers primarily. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean it can't be enjoyed by anyone, but primarily, the majority viewership of it, young girls. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. The demographics of it are not something I want to delve into too deeply. I mean, it's interesting from a sociological point of view and from a socio-entertainment point of view, I guess. But there's also just the question of just trying to produce work that is suitable for young viewers and then young readers, and doing your best to fit the tone of the world they've established. Yeah.
But just glancing at Wikipedia, and apparently, like the first round was from 81, 82 up until the mid-90s.
You're right.
And then there was a second toy line in 97 that didn't last very long, just a couple of years.
Sure.
And then in 2003, there were more toys.
Right.
Says they closely resembled the original toy line. And it sold approximately 100 million ponies globally by 2010.
That sounds about right, yeah. I mean, there's always an everlasting appeal to animals in general, horses in particular.
And then this fourth iteration started in 2010. So.
Yeah, 2010 actually, you're right. I said 2011, I think, but 2010, yeah. Yeah, it's, I don't know. I mean, it's something of an evergreen franchise in the sense that, kids are always going to like playing with horses, and there's an appeal for a kid in playing with a toy that is, or rather, let's see how to put this. Not an appeal so much as it's sometimes easier for kids to invest in characters that are specifically non-human yet still relatable. I mean, there are shows produced for kids and shows that kids enjoy with human characters, obviously. But there's something about animals or non-human characters that helps separate. This is just sort of me spitballing a theory here. There's a level at which it makes it easier for a kid to identify with something that the less realistic it is. Or at least if there's a degree of difference between the world that you live in and the world that you're seeing. It's easier to identify with, for example, a pastel pink horse who can do magic than it is in some cases to identify with a kid like yourself, but who, I'm trying to think of another show example here, but maybe a kid who has superpowers, or a kid who's got lives in a haunted house or something. Well, I think that there's a way in which certain shows can use the level of unreality to their benefit as a way of connecting, of making characters more relatable. And there's probably some sociological principles that go into this that I can't think of off the top of my head. Sociological, psychological principles that go into how we identify with a character. Something almost like an opposite uncanny. No, actually, it's very much an uncanny valley thing. I think it can be more difficult for someone to relate to a character the closer they are to you, yet different in some crucial respects. Whereas a character that's less like you in the sense that they're quadrupedal, don't wear clothes, have unicorn horns, etc. That makes it in a way easier to relate to because they are different from you and yet have similar psychological problems. They face similar issues about friendship that you might face. They have anxiety problems, or they they worry about this thing or that thing, and yet they're in a very unreal world in which horses can talk and cast magic and and things like that. I don't know. I'm spitballing some, but I do think there's something to the idea that a slight, a deliberate deviation from reality makes a show or a franchise or any set of characters more relatable in a way than trying to make something that hews closer to reality. Anyway, sorry, that was part one of my doctoral thesis.
Now, was this emphasis on friendship? Did this come in with the 2010 version, or
I don't think so. Again, I mean, I'm less familiar with previous generations. I do know that the franchise has always been somewhat didactic. Sounds too harsh. Not didactic, and it's not, pedagogical, and it's not trying to, hammer a set of basic virtues into kids. But as with any kids show, I mean, every episode is meant to have a message or a core idea or a theme or something. And I think having friendship in the subtitle of the show is definitely hammering it home as a core theme. And of course, they have the 6 magical elements of a harmony, which represent all of friendship. That I'm sure the 6 elements of harmony that. I know, I'm kidding. I mean, they've sort of emphasized it as a set of as quasi magical virtues, and this idea of like what how to solve friendship problems. And in the first season, Princess Twilight Sparkle always writes in letters to Princess Celestia asking for help on a friendship problem or describing how she solved this friendship problem. Things like that. I mean, there's an emphasis on interpersonal relationships that, again, to be fair, I don't know to what degree that's true of previous generations. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's been more or less the same emphasis on those ideas all the way through. I think that maybe it stands out more because that's seen as somewhat corny and old-fashioned, or somewhat corny, I guess is the best way to put it, in comparison to more recent kids shows. There's been discussions of sort of the idea of neo-sincerity or the new sincerity, or the idea that everything that's even nominally for kids is so cynical, and I think there's some truth to that. I think there's maybe too much hand-wringing over the possibility that our kids are all growing up cynical. But I mean, I did grow up watching The Simpsons and then watching Animaniacs, which played even further with the notions of kids shows having messages. The Animaniacs would routinely end an episode with the Wheel of Morality, where they would bring out like a Wheel of Fortune style thing and say, okay, what's the lesson we're supposed to have learned from this episode? And they'd spin it and it would spit out some completely nonsensical fortune cookie phrase. Like they were making fun of that concept even back then. This is early 90s. And that was what I grew up on. And so I think that even I have a somewhat cynical view of of human nature, but then also in media aimed at children. And I think that's another thing, is that like, I think there's a very fine balance in writing for kids and for writing for different types of kids and writing for different very fine ages of kids. I mean, writing for a third grader isn't from writing for a sixth grader or writing for a seventh grader or anything along those lines. Kids in different developmental periods have different desires to see in their media, different representational biases. And I think My Little Pony just does a lot of things really well. I think that if I had to sort of boil down what I've found about writing for kids or kid-oriented media into a couple of pithy statements, and I do have to do that because this is a podcast. I mean, there's a couple of big intertwined ideas, and the first is that I think a lot of kids media in general, approach writing for kids with the idea that kids are dumb. Kids are stupid, and they will sort of accept anything you throw at them. And I think that's a very wrong way to look at it. Kids are not dumb. Kids are ignorant, but that's a different thing. They don't have life experience. They don't have the experience of having done this thing or that thing. They don't necessarily know how all the rules of the world work, but they're not idiots. And treating them as such is a very, very bad idea, because the other sort of big pithy statement that I think should be nailed to the foreheads of every animation film producer from now until doomsday is that kids don't like being treated like kids. I mean, kids in their own minds are people, and they should be treated as such. They may be smaller than average than people. They may not have the life experience of other people, but don't treat them like kids. Don't talk down to them. Don't sort of make a goof out of their smallness, and don't joke around them as if they're never going to understand you. They don't necessarily have the same view of the world that we do as adults, that we cynical, hardened, bitter, calloused adults do. And you don't have to give them all that in all its horrific, dripping glory, but, let them understand that there are some things they don't quite have a grip on yet, and, we can help you get there. Eventually, slowly, gradually.
Yeah, well, I read the first issue that you wrote of the sort of its prequel to the upcoming movie. Right.
So this is the official My Little Pony movie for the Friendship is Magic iteration of the franchise. Right. That's coming out in September. I'm not entirely sure about that. Whoops. But yeah, so I wrote a four-part prequel.
You say that 5 times.
Four-part prequel to that. The second issue, well, as we're recording this, the second issue is about to come out next week. And yeah, the first part is out so far.
But yeah, so I read that, and I felt like the humor might not be accessible to kids necessarily. Although, I mean, I know that when I was a kid, back in the age of Gold Key comics, I read stuff that had jokes in it that I didn't get. And I picked up some of those comics again. I remember picking up some Harvey comics from my childhood, like when I was in high school. Like, these are funny. I didn't get this joke when I was 5.
Yeah. I mean, that's another thing. Kids always love to read up, and I think it is important that kids read up. They read things that are beyond them in the sense that they make jokes or they make references to things that they just don't have the context for. And I think that's important because, yeah, you're going to miss a few jokes when you're a kid, but it's going to encourage you to sort of think more broadly. It's going to stick in your mind that I never got this joke when I was a kid, and then you'll come back, like you say, 20 years later or whatever. And
the alternative is just to write it really stupid, I would guess.
Well, exactly. I mean, so in this case, so that first issue that I wrote, that's all about the character who is the big villain of the movie, and of course of the prequel too, the Storm King, who is voiced by Liv Schreiber. Which the all-star cast that we got for this movie is kind of ridiculous. Liv Schreiber, Sia, Uzo Aduba. Yeah, it's ludicrous.
Is he in it too? Ludicrous?
No, you're right. No, he should have been. No, unfortunately, he's not. Michael Pena is though. I like him a lot. But yeah, so Liv Schreiber's Storm King, who's sort of I probably can't say too much. The movie isn't out yet, but he's sort of an interestingly manic villain. He's not sort of a straight-on grim, growly tyrant type. He's at times almost more like a jokey middle manager in a weird way. He's still sinister and he still wants to do sort of horrible things and has horrible plans in motion, but like he's almost sort of like he's talking about branding and like, getting the message out, how am I going to work this into the organizational paradigm or stuff like that in a weird, goofy way. And, of course, kids are going to have absolutely no context for that, having never worked under a goofy middle manager. I mean, hopefully. Child labor laws are still in place. And I don't know. I mean, but that same sort of goofy energy, I think, is still understandable to kids. And that's something I wanted to get across. So the comics also are in a weird position because they're for a slightly older audience than the show in general is, I would say, just by virtue of the fact that as comics they have to be read. And that puts them at a slightly older developmental age than the show in general, on balance. the comics have been able to do a couple things that the show hasn't quite been able to get away with, and as such, it also can be a little bit weirder and darker than the show is. So, like, this whole first issue, for example, is from the villain's perspective and shows some kind of awful things happening, and there's no one really sympathetic to root for along the way.
Yeah.
As a setup for the movie, I hope it works. I got paid for it. I wanted to make sure it fit in with the movie as well as it could. But, like, as a setup for the movie, I wanted to do something that showed, here's the villain they're going to be up against, and here's the kind of horrible things they're going to have to fight, and this is maybe even be darker than the movie gets. I haven't actually seen the movie. I've read the script and I've seen concept art. I haven't seen the movie as of yet. I think the comic might go a little darker than the movie. I don't know.
So how much free reign did you have in plotting this comic, since you're leading up to something written by someone else?
Well, it's a lot, and more than I expected, actually. So when I was talking with my editor, Bobby Curnow at IDW, about the comic, the first thing I thought of was, okay, it's a 4-issue prequel. Easy way to do, not easy way, but sort of one of the clearest possible ways to do that is do one issue about each of 4 of the main not the main characters, the new characters that are going to be introduced in the movie. Give us an introduction to the villain, and then 3 other characters who played major roles in the film. Which Bobby was like, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. It's a pretty clear way of doing things. It'll introduce readers to, like, oh, here are some people you're going to be seeing in slightly different situations. Here's how they're going to interact. Here's what the history they might have with one another. And I knew Hasbro was going to be more or less okay with all of that, because the movie is set up such that we have these characters and we're dumped into into them being very particular types of characters, very particular archetypes. No spoilers. I got to avoid spoilers. Which means that they have sort of implied backgrounds that were never spelled out explicitly. And in this case, I got to spell them out explicitly. I had to run everything by Hasbro to say, hey, can it be that this character has done this, this, and this character comes from this kind of background? And they were like, yeah, sure. And when I say that I had more free reign than I expected, it's something that I found out very late in the process. There's a couple of chapter books that are also being written to tie in with the movie, which are completely separate, of course, from the comics, because it's a completely different company, because licensing and publishing and a million other nightmares. And I was having a lot of trouble finding out. One of the chapter books was about the backstory of one of the characters in the movie. I'm having to be really careful about what I say here. But a part of that character's backstory that would come chronologically before the comic I was writing. So I had to take that into account. And I didn't know that character's backstory as revealed in the chapter book. Fortunately, I happen to be Twitter friends with the woman who writes a lot of the chapter books, but not this particular chapter book. So I had to email her. I had to say, like, okay, do you know what this is? And she's like, yeah, okay, so the deal is this, this, and this. And I'm like, okay, cool, perfect, thanks. And I wrote that in. And then I discover that chapter book was actually still being written, and there were sections of it that were taking place chronologically after my comic as well, and would take into account what I was doing in the comic. And I had no idea they were doing this. I was like, wait a minute, so, like, there's a magical MacGuffin thing that shows up in the comic. This thing. So this is my other bit of cleverness. This idea that there's a 4-issue prequel. It's like, okay, you do one issue about each of the characters. That's great. I thought, what if I could also do a thing where I could have some object that ties them all together? So there's a magical artifact in this comic strip, the Misfortune Malachite. It's a cursed jewel that brings misfortune to whoever possesses it. And basically, it falls to every character's hands in each of these 4 issues. The Storm King has it in the first issue. He loses it. Goes to the next character. It goes to the next character. Goes to the next character. And it all affects their lives in horrible, depressing ways, basically. And so what happens to the Misfortune Malachite in the very end, and what happens to the character who has it, and how it affects things in the movie and in the chapter book, all had to be kind of sorted out. Because I didn't realize, the chapter book is going to directly use some of the scenes that I wrote as, like, the basis for scenes in the book. And I'm like, that's cool, but at the same time, I didn't really want to force this poor writer, I don't even know who the writer is, because they write under a pseudonym. And I think they write under, actually, wait a minute. Well, in any case, I didn't want to have to force that poor writer to, take my story as written, and I didn't realize they were going to be, using all my crazy mixed up nonsense to make this work. And it's bizarre. It's weird. It really is. As with sort of any major franchise with licensed elements, there's, it's right hands and left hands and nobody talking to one another, and there's a lot of confusion and a lot of not knowing. I've had one or two comic scripts or comic pitches that were turned down because we've got a similar story coming up in the show, which I had no way of knowing. Yeah. But it's just, they're already going to be doing that one, so that goes in the trash. So it's a bizarre way to break into the industry is on a very, very big franchise like this, in which a lot of, I've never had any major complaints about it. I've never run up against Hasbro saying, no, you absolutely cannot do this, but why? Certainly compared to some of the other licensing horror stories I've heard from friends, they've given me a pretty free hand in what kind of stories I can tell. But, there's always a couple boxes have to be checked, and a couple of T's have to be crossed, and I's have to be dotted, and make sure that this character talks like this, and this character does this, and this character can't do that, and that's the price of working in a franchise. It just naturally.
Yeah.
Coming up, mixing My Little Pony with its polar opposite and getting away with it, getting from a concept to a story, a 1-minute history of the magical girl genre, and more. Welcome to our newest patrons, Adam and Joe. We appreciate all our patrons whose contributions help keep Deconstructing Comics and To the Bat Poles afloat. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help, visit patreon.com/deconcomics and pledge your support. You can also make a one-time donation of any amount through PayPal. Send it to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Shortbox Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
And the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
Continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com. or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
So, about how many issues of My Little Pony books have you written so far?
So, I actually haven't done a proper count in a while. I think last time I checked, it was more than 24, I want to say, individual issues. That's a little bit complicated by the fact that there was there was a thing where they had a 48-ish page annual comic in which 8 pages were done by somebody else. And then there was a different thing where I did the 8 pages and then also the 40 pages. And the numbers shake out weirdly. Something in the neighborhood of 24 issues. And that's over the course of, let's see, my first issue came out in August, September, somewhere of that in 2013, I think. I'm trying to do the math now in my head. And it's about that, it's late July 2017, so it's 4 years now. Yeah, that sounds about right. And yeah, that's been a lot of pony work. That's been it's been a lot of working in a very particular sandbox. And as much as I love the sandbox, I'm also, I am working on other projects. I'm going in different directions. So one thing, not to move off of ponies, but I do have an upcoming piece. Boom Studios is doing. They have a lot of licensed books. They have issues from the show, The Amazing World of Gumball, which is another really great kids show, and that's in a very different camp from My Little Pony.
Yeah,
you've seen it. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
it's I wouldn't describe it as super cynical, but at the same time, it's extremely meta. It's very meta-aware. It's very aware of the tropes and jokes in kids' shows, and it goes out of its way to play with them and mess with them and sort of, point out the ridiculous storytelling loopholes and the oddities of things that happen along the way. And I love it just as much, in a very different way than My Little Pony, but it's still a great show. It's just a very, very different type of show. And I was able to get that because I had a completely unrelated pitch that I sent to Boom, and they were like, well, we're not going to take this, but would you be interested in working on other licensed projects? I'm like, absolutely. They mentioned Gumball, and I'm like, hell yes, please, let me do that. So I got to do an 8-page short for that. And that'll be out, I think, August 30th. It's a compendium issue. It's multiple different people doing stories. I don't actually know who else is doing stories, but I know I'm in there. So, yeah, I don't know. It's always interesting to play in somebody else's sandbox like that. It's fun to find the little loopholes and corners. I mean, my Gumball story, actually half of the reason I came up with it is because I wanted to solve a minor weird canonical dispute over this one character, and I came up with a clever way of making a joke about something that seemingly contradicts itself in the show, and I can't get too specific because I don't want to spoil anything. But it's in the terminology of the fan world, it's a fic. It's a thing that exists to sort of patch up a very, very minor plot hole. Just for the heck of it, because I could. And it's also, I think of it as a perfectly good story on its own. But in my heart, part of the reason it's there is to make a very, very small adjustment to the canon. Because I can.
I see. Okay. Well, so I guess most of these stories that you've written have been like one-issue things, or
mostly, yeah. There's and with certain specific restrictions. Well, not even restrictions, but just certain different focuses. So the first story I wrote, so they've had all along, they've had sort of the main series, The My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, the main series, which is intended to be in the same vein as the episodes. They're just sort of the standard adventures of what's called the Mane Six, MANE. Like horse mane, sexy, you understand? That's a joke. And then they've always had sort of a secondary side series. So when I started on, that was the micro series, in which it was every issue was about one of the main six, one of those main characters. My very first issue was about Pinkie Pie, and I was quite proud of that issue, and I still am. Still think it's one of my best. And then I did a couple of issues on that, and then on the following series, which was My Little Pony Friends Forever, in which they took two characters and they had some random adventure, some wacky adventure between these two characters who may or may not have ever met in the show. And that was a lot of fun, actually, because, again, it's about getting to sort of explore little side bits of the canon that never maybe got brought up in the show. In one of my issues, I got to, there are these two characters who have been friends of Princess Twilight Sparkle for the entire series, and yet in the show have never really met. So I thought, well, what if I did an issue about the two of them hanging out for a whole issue? And so, what's their similarities? What's their differences? What's their stories? And so those have all been single issues. And then I've been able to do a couple multi-issue arcs on the main series. I think, let's see, 3 separate multi-issue arcs on the main series. I may be missing something. No, three different multi-issue arcs, and then a couple standalone issues, and then a couple annuals, and a holiday special.
Okay.
In which it of course is not Christmas, you understand. It's Hearth's Warming Eve, but it's the holiday season.
I see. So
yeah.
the analog to Christmas.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of those. There's Hearth's Warming Eve, and then there's oh Lord, what's the Halloween equivalent? Nightmare Night. Of course, exactly. Yeah. And those have all been really fun. It's been an interesting challenge because in a lot of cases I've had to. This is one of those things where I'm trying to remember where I read this, but the idea of like every great art form having a particularly limited version of it, like the 3-minute pop song to music, the half-hour TV show, the 200-page novel, like. Every art form has a specific sort of limited version where it's like you could go off and do the 400-hour movie if you wanted, or you could do the symphony that's 6 days long or whatever. But the limited forms are interesting challenges for creators to work within the confines of this specific. It has to be X, however long it has to be. So in this case, 20 pages long, or 22 pages long, or 48 pages long. And it's always been interesting for me to as a challenge, just to think like, okay, well, I have to get the pacing right so that not only does it fill that entire void, but also the arc is there the whole way through, and there's enough to keep the interest through all however many pages, and keep the reader sort of reading at the right speed, as it were. Yeah, I don't know. It's been an interesting challenge. I just recently did apart from the prequel, which is sort of its own issue because that's because that was 4 separate stories and yet sort of also one big story. I did get to do a 3-issue story that was my biggest thing yet. Wait, was it 3 issues or 4 issues? Gosh, now I'm even forgetting all this stuff. No, it was 3 issues. That was the biggest one I'd done yet, and it was the most interesting challenge because it was I had to figure out how do I maintain interest across this whole thing when there's sort of a limited number of plot twists that I have set out, and I'm only going to be doing this, and this has to happen here, and so forth. Yeah. It's always an interesting challenge, and of course now I'm working on other projects that have different limitations of I suddenly have a whole lot more space, which means that's great, and also I have to fill all this space and make it all work as a book or whatever.
So if you get assigned to an issue, and it's not like a prequel to a movie or something, it's just an annual or something, and so how do you come up with a story?
Well, it's been an interesting. So I listed all sort of the different series and sub-series that they've done so far. They had the micro-series, and they have the main series, and they had the holiday special. And in some cases, I've just been allowed to pitch whatever I wanted. For the main series, I got to pitch one of my favorite stories. I got to pitch a 1-issue story in which it turned out that one of the sort of minor characters had an identical twin sister who's a professional wrestler. And of course, as must happen, her twin sister sprains her ankle before the big match. So of course she has to train and fill in for her at the big match. And she's like the meek school teacher, so of course she has to suddenly learn how to be the scary, threatening wrestler in the ring and all that. And I'm so happy. Earlier when I was talking about Hasbro letting me sort of get away with a lot, that was the one where I was really are you really going to let me do this? Are you going to let me do a professional wrestling issue? And they did, and I am forever grateful to them for that. But that was just I just thought, what's the most preposterous thing I could combine with My Little Pony? Oh, professional wrestling. And that was basically where it came from. But for things like the holiday special or the annuals have been things that tied into specific sort of sub-franchises or very specific iterations. So in addition to the main My Little Pony Friendship is Magic series, there is this sort of quasi-spin-off thing of the My Little Pony Equestria Girls, which is an alternate universe in which all the characters exist, but they're all humans going to Canterlot High School. And Twilight Sparkle from the Pony World occasionally visits this human world by going through a magical portal. And they're just multicolored humans who all look exactly like her friends and act exactly like their friends. And it's very strange. This is, I'm in no way mean this in a negative light, but this is, again, the franchise is at least partly merchandise driven.
Yeah.
And having human-shaped dolls means another sort of slate of things they can sell. So having another world in which everyone is a human makes it so they can sell those more easily.
Yeah, well, I saw in the prequel issue there was this whole world of cats.
Oh, well, okay, that's its own thing, because there is a character, so in the movie they've introduced 3 or 4 new species entirely. They introduced, cats, they introduced bird people, they introduced a couple other things.
All those pirate parrots.
Oh, the pirate parrots! Oh, I love them. I didn't even get to show their home world. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to the parrot world or whatever. But I did get to go to the cat land of Abyssinia, which had been mentioned in a couple of other issues. So I felt safe in using it. Oh my God! There's Abyssinia. There's the Griffin land. There's Yakistan. There's so many wondrous lands in this world. But yeah, so for those comics, those have had particular. Not mandates, starting points. Those we knew that we wanted. Well, the holiday issue is, an obvious example. It's it has to be about the holidays. It's got to be. It's about the holidays, and it's in the Equestria Girls universe. So it's about the human equivalent ponies, the human equivalent, the parallel pony world. And there were apart from hey, it's a holiday thing, and hey, it's the human world. I had no. They gave me no other specific instructions. They weren't it had to be a story about this, this, or this. It didn't have to feature this character. It was, here's 48 pages with these restrictions. What do you got? Sorry, my throat's growing dry. That was a lot of fun, actually. I quite enjoyed making that issue in general. I quite enjoyed coming up with it. I quite enjoyed writing it. I thought the end product was really well. I was really proud of it. It's a weird one because I knew, going into it, you want to have something that's sort of a a holiday message, something about, the things that we celebrate at this winter solstice time. Ideas of family and forgiveness and togetherness and closeness and how that manifested with this particular slate of characters. And I got to sort of pitch them a story, again, a slightly longer story than I usually do, because most of the standard issues are 22 or 20 pages, and this is 48, and it's like, well, I got twice as much space to tell a single unified story. I could go in more variation. I had more room for sort of stylistic weirdness or diversionary moments.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm curious because, thinking of your sort of the concept as part of it, like, okay, we'll mix My Little Pony with pro wrestling, but then beyond that, then you have to come up with a story there and not just the concept. So
right.
How do you kind of take that step to making the actual story?
Oh boy, I mean that is sort of where the magic happens. Yeah. Again, what I said earlier about sort of this being not a didactic series, but a series in which every episode and every piece has to have some sort of idea, some driving theme. Not a message necessarily, but just like some concept that holds at its core. And that's, I've found, been the most successful way to think of it for me, is like, well, okay, if this story is about X, then every scene in it, every page, every panel, every interaction has to in some way reflect or show or come back to this concept. And the pro wrestling, that's actually kind of a poor example, because the concept there was pro wrestling is great. But I mean, well, actually, so knowing going into it, I knew I had obviously the pro wrestling angle. Like, I just wanted to have pro wrestling going on. And then I was like, well, who's the least likely character to do pro wrestling? And I'm like, well, the meek, quiet, good-natured school teacher, of course. So give her a twin sister. And then from there, it's actually, a lot of that was just plot considerations of the idea of like, well, why is she wrestling now? And it's like, well, her twin sister needs her help. And it's like, why does her twin sister come back? And it's like, well, maybe they had a fight years ago. Maybe they are on bad terms with each other. Maybe they, the only reason they become they make up as sisters again is because Cherry Lee, who's the school teacher, sort of learns to respect what her sister does by virtue of standing in for her in the ring and so forth. And once I had that, sort of thematic through line down, it more or less fell into place, because I could think, okay, I know that this is going to be the climax. I know I have this. This is sort of the emotional moment that has to sew everything up, and I want to pace up to it, and I want to pace down from it as an epilogue and so forth. I'm trying to think of examples of the opposite, and there have been a couple stories of mine where I felt like I got away from having a very strong central core idea, and I think they suffered for it. I mean, I think there have been a couple which I can admit my mistakes. I can admit that I've written some issues that are less amazing. There's been some issues where either I didn't have a strong idea going into it, or the idea got kind of lost along the way, or I just had to edit things to a point where the idea had to kind of fall by the wayside, and that, I don't know, the issue kind of suffered for it. In general, it just boils down to finding not only a message that works, or a message or a theme or an idea that works, but then also a way to sell it in a story, and that's just a peculiar kind of alchemy. Knowing like what vehicle will be best for for making a message about confidence, or gosh, now I'm even trying to think of some of the other stories that I've come up with along the way. Finding whatever it is about your friend that makes them special to you, things like that. Finding the right sort of vehicle to tell that story is just it's a bit of authorial magic. And then in some cases, well, I also mentioned actually the other issues where it was two characters sort of randomly thrown together. For some of those, I literally did, when I was coming up with pitches for that series, where the idea was basically take two characters and have them on the page, I would literally put names in a hat and pull them out and see could I possibly do a story about these two? And it's like, oh, well, actually, this character has, this is their thing. This is their, personal major character trait, or this is their background, whatever. And this character, this is their thing. And, how would those interact? Why would this one character and this other character be stuck in an elevator for 10 hours? Not an elevator, but they don't have elevators in Ponyville usually. But, what would put them together, and what would conflict with the two of them, or what would they bond over, or what would be in any way an interesting interaction for them to have. And that was really fun. I mentioned, so the first thing I did for that series was two characters who had both, like one is sort of Twilight Sparkle's mentor, and then one is Twilight Sparkle's assistant, sort of, as it were. And the two of them, basically, I just put them together in a story because they had never really interacted in the show. And it's like, well, they both have very, very strong ties to this third character who isn't appearing in the issue at all. And, how do they deal with being in this character's orbit and not quite their own character at times? What are their concerns for this character? How do they see themselves? And kind of go from there. Yeah, I don't know. Stories can come from a lot of places. In some cases, I've come up with the idea first, or the theme first. In some cases, I've come up with the plot first. In some cases, I've come up with I want to do something with this character first. And in every case, it's just sort of making sure all the other elements fall into line. And then once you do, the story kind of sorts itself out. Unless it's like those two issues that I mentioned, where it's like, no, those two didn't work so well. There have been one or two where I'm just like, oh god, I gotta have this, 2 more pages of these characters, and it's just not working out. Yeah, it's not everything is gold.
So, have you tried writing anything recently that was outside of a franchise like those?
So yes, and I have like 3 things that I would love to talk about. I cannot officially talk about any of them because contracts have not yet technically been signed.
I see.
I would really love to. I honestly would, but I don't know to what degree I can. I have 2 or 3 things in the works. Okay, so one of them is absolutely for kids, but is its own non-franchised, original, creator-owned thing.
Or could become a franchise.
Knock on wood, fingers crossed, etc. That is absolutely the joy, because then I get to sit back in my socks and watch the checks roll in.
Yeah.
There's another one that would be aimed at young adults, at teen readers. And then there's one that is an adult. Well, the problem with saying that it's a work for adults means it automatically sounds like it's porn or something really gory. I don't mean in those senses. I just mean it's a grown-up book. It has grown-up thoughts in it and big words. It has characters who are morally gray and not entirely likable and who do occasionally bad things, and that's about it. I mean, to be fair, that one actually does also have some sex and some gore in it. But that's, unrelated to those things. Yeah, I mean, it's an odd reflection of the fact of how I came into the industry that I've been working on a franchise, not just on franchise books, but a very specific franchise for so long. That now it's a little bit, it's not, I wouldn't say it's difficult for me to move outside it, although it has been some time for me to, it's taken a while for me to get a pitch or 2 off the ground. But it's interesting in that I've been working on a title for 4 years now. I've been making some, decent money, and I've been doing some good stuff with it. I feel like I definitely have improved as a writer over these years that I've been working on it. And now it's just a question of stepping out and convincing them that, hey, I've got some other stuff that isn't ponies, and would you like to see that? I mean, to some degree, that's ponies. The reason I liked it in the first place is it's still very much in my comfort zone. I like stuff that's fun. I like stuff that's light and fluffy and cute. I'm working on a pitch right now. This is not one of the ones that is in any way tied up with contract stuff, so I can talk about it. I'm working on a pitch right now. Some of the art is up on my Twitter and on my Tumblr and all those places, which is basically a cross between cheerleaders and the magical girl genre, called Sunshine Cheer Squad Go. And that's because, and it is very much hewing to the classics of the magical girl genre, that subgenre of anime and manga, which is, usually a group of adolescent girls who in some way get magical or otherworldly powers and use it to fight the forces of evil. Sure. I've been working for a while now on a whole dissertation about the history of the magical girl genre, because it's crazier than you might ever imagine. It all comes down to Bewitched, basically. The first magical girl series were literally based on the American sitcom Bewitched.
Yeah, it was huge in Japan.
But then, in the 80s, it evolved because because Studio Pierrot did this thing where they did a media mix with this underappreciated idol singer that they had on contract, and they decided, well, let's make a whole anime about her. And they did, and that was Magical Angel Creamy Mami, and that brought in elements that would later become staples of the magical girl genre, like the normal girl thrust into otherworldly circumstances, the talking cutesy animal mascot, the magical transformations, I think this is fascinating. I'm derailing, but my point is, it's a genre that I love quite a lot, and there's a lot that resonates to me about it. And it's very much also, I mean, knowing that I am someone who worked on My Little Pony and then looking at the stuff that the artist I'm working with now is producing, you can definitely see the through lines. There's a lot of color, there's a lot of life, there's a lot of character variety, there's, but at the same time appealing to certain character archetypes. Yeah, I'm excited about all these projects, but that's the one I can talk about right now. But yeah, if you'd like to, should I sell myself now, or do I wait until the end of the podcast? I can give everyone links to my Twitters and Tumblrs and Facebooks and all that stuff.
I wanted to ask, so I was at Hot Comics the other day.
Oh, yeah.
So I met Katie Rex. She took me over there. And I was looking at the comics for kids. I don't know if have you looked at like other kids' comics lately?
That's always the downside of being a comics creator. You never have time to look at other comics.
Yeah.
I honestly have not. I have not been keeping up with... Well, okay, to be fair, some of the stuff I've been keeping up with has been things that are more in book form as opposed to individual issues. I don't read a lot of licensed stuff, or at least I read all the Pony books, obviously, just because I want to keep current on what all the other writers are doing. But I haven't read a lot of the other licensed books. I have been into... a couple of the slightly older, like the middle grade reader stuff. Oni Press had this series, Space Battle Lunchtime, for example. That was a lot of fun. I am way behind on Lumberjanes, but I remember liking that a lot. There's been, what else have I been up to lately? Faith Erin Hicks's The Nameless City. I've been reading that with great anticipation for the third volume of that. Licensed books, though, not so much. And it's probably just because... I don't know. There aren't a lot of series that I would willingly read licensed stuff up. Well, there's not a lot of series that I follow in general. There's not a lot of kids shows that I follow, apart from My Little Pony and I guess Gumball, that I would want to check up on the comics versions.
But it just sort of struck me, and maybe it was just the combination that happened to be on the shelf at the time or whatever, but I felt like they sort of skewed female, which was kind of surprising to me, considering what a male-dominated readership comics have had in the States.
Well, that is a whole conversation, yeah. Well, as a man, talking about women, no. I mean, that's part of the obvious paradox of sort of talking about this, is I don't have the perspective necessarily to answer, why it is. Is it truly a thing that there's a sea change in comics, that suddenly there's a lot more, not only female creators, but female readers and female-oriented books, if that's a way to put it. Mm-hmm. It may be that there's an actual sea change. It may just be that they're getting more attention. It may just be that they're more visible. I mean, it may also be, you pointed out, who helped you at Hot Comics, Katie Rex, a member of the Valkyries, which is the all-female comic shop employees. Calling it a club sounds demeaning. Organization, army? There we go. Army, yeah. Comic shop employee, all-female comic shop employee army. The fact that organization exists, though, is also proof positive that, yeah, there's women in here who are working to make the industry's male domination for so many years obvious, and then also work to dismantle that. I don't know if I can speak to, why it is all of a sudden that they're... And there's also, to some degree, there's a question of, is it that there are more than ever, or is this just sort of a similar perception bias that... among other things, I've been reading a lot of psychology stuff lately for grad school stuff, and one of the things I've been reading about is perception bias of, for example, how much women talk, or how dominated a particular group or, lineup of women there are. The perception of it as opposed to the reality. Even when women still speak only, say, 15% of the time, in a lot of situations they're seen as dominating the conversation. And even when there's only maybe 2 or 3 women in a group, it's still seen as sort of women heavy or something like that. So not to discount your own perceptions, but I'm just saying, to what degree is it really that there's more of this than there has been, and to what degree is it just that it's more visible, or to what degree is it that we still think we see a very male industry, which has always been, in some corners, friendly to women. I'm not going to say that comics have always been friendly to women. There's a trope called women in refrigerators for a reason. Let's not kid ourselves. But it's been changing now for decades. And to what degree has it? if you want to even talk mainstream stuff, going back to, well, I guess ElfQuest wouldn't count as mainstream. Well, whatever. I mean, let the historians debate it. But I think that, yeah, there is a definite sea change, although to the degree to which it's just a perceived sea change or whether it's an actual sea change, get out the title measurement sticks. The measurement, I don't know. I was making a joke there with something. Yeah. In any case, what it boils down to is, yes, girls like comics, and I like that. I do think that there is this recognition that, oh yeah, girls like comics too, and not just girls like girl comics, but girls like comics in general. I mean, girls can like action comics and adventure comics and superhero comics if they're written such that they're not inherently gross and terrible. I mean, as like Ms. Marvel has proven, for example. I mean, that's consistently been one of Marvel's best-selling books, and it is straight up superhero action. It's straight up teen superhero action. It fits right into the tradition of classic Spider-Man, having to conceal his secret identity while running around the high school halls and stuff like that. But the fact that it's a female protagonist, the fact that it's written by a woman, the fact, I mean, even apart from questions of race and religious representation in that as well, just those facts alone make it much more friendly to female readers. I mean, just because they're finally getting to see themselves as a superhero, which I think is awesome. So yeah, speaking as a man, I'm glad that again, I know that I'm. It's a little weird for me to try and comment on this, but yeah, I like the way that the winds have been changing, and I like to see them keep changing. And yeah, there's still a little bit of additional hypocrisy of a guy who never played with My Little Ponies writing them growing up, but I don't know. I think guys can enjoy that stuff too.
Are you from this area originally?
I am. I'm from Minneapolis. Grew up here. Went to Chicago for college, and then came back here. Yeah, Minneapolis is Minneapolis is one of those changing cities. It's one of those. It's the new Portland, maybe. I don't know if I want it to be the new Portland. It's it's becoming more people friendly. It's becoming more bike friendly. It's certainly very politically progressive, as both as a city and I think as a state and as a whole. And there's a pretty good group of cartoonists here. The cartoonists, and I mean cartoonists, and also long running comics people in general. I mean, you mentioned, I think Dan Jurgens still lives in the state.
Yeah.
Neil Gaiman lives just outside the state borders. Walt Simonson, I believe, still lives in town. And then, of course, you have all this new crop of strange people coming up, like us here at World Monster Headquarters, with our strange ideas. Well, it also helps. Minneapolis is home to one of only a couple colleges in the country that has a comics art degree, the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. MCAD has one of maybe three. It's in like the top 3 or 4 of colleges that even have comics art majors. So yeah, there's a good crop of us comics type people in town. Yeah, it's a good place to be. I like it out here.
Yeah. Okay, so what's coming up from you?
Oh well, again, I mean, I can't talk too much. Well, then I can talk about, hush, hush. Well, so as I mentioned, I mean, I don't know also when this is going to be coming out, but the prequel, My Little Pony movie prequel series is still coming out and should be right up until the day the movie comes out. Like I said, I have a short story, The Amazing World of Gumball issue that's come out August 30th. In the next couple months, I may be able to announce some things. Hint, hint. I don't actually know. Nudge, nudge. I'm not actually certain about anything, but if all goes well, I have a number of projects that I've been working on for years that may come to fruition very soon, possibly, maybe, knock on wood, hopefully. Is there any wood around here to knock on this press board? Anyway, I maintain a web presence of sorts. Check me out. I'm on Twitter at Ted Lee Anderson. That's my usual nickname, TEDLY ANDERSON. I'm on Tumblr at the same name, and gosh, that might actually be it. I don't really have a functioning website. I think I have a couple URLs, but they just redirect to my Tumblr. So
yeah, well, I clicked the link from the World Monster Headquarters, and it was a blog from like 2012. Oh
yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, okay. So I used her on a blog post, Blogspot blog. Yeah, and then I transferred it all to my Tumblr. Oh gosh, I got to update that. I'm also, I think I have tedanderson.org and .net, but I think tedanderson.com is owned by some guy who owns a company that makes conveyor belts for food products. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, I've been trying to get that for years.
His name is Ted Anderson.
Well, his name is Ted Anderson. You know, there's probably a lot of us around.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Certainly in this area, with
well,
a Scandinavian background.
Oh, God, yeah, you don't even want to know. There were so many. I grew up with a Ted Johnson in elementary school, and he was kind of a troublemaker, and so every so often my parents would get a call about, your son did this, and this. Is like, no, you're thinking of the other Ted. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, the Ted Lee Anderson is usually what I go by on whatever social media platform there is. And yeah, I do try to keep my Twitter and Tumblr updated for what projects I'm working on. I mentioned that one Sunshine Cheer Squad Go. That one is moving into the pitch phase, hopefully relatively soon. And then I have 2 or 3 other things that may or may not be hitting the actual contracting stage soon as well. So I'm making a shrugging motion right now. You can only hear me, but I'm making a very exaggerated shrugging motion.
Okay.
But look forward to all that. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Ted Anderson is on Twitter at Tedley Anderson. That's Tedly Anderson with an O. Let us know what you thought of this episode. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, Twitter @DeconComics. Like our Facebook page or join our Facebook discussion group. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The latest episode is right behind this one in the podcast feed. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Polls, our wrap-up of Season 2, and lots of interesting correspondence from our listeners. Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. Next week, a look at the burgeoning comic scene in Minneapolis, where a local comic shop is holding a new comic book day bar event every Wednesday. The week I was there, the event included an interview with a creator whose work has been discussed on Critiquing Comics, and you'll hear that interview next week, as well as a talk with Katie Rex, a comics creator and one of the people behind this weekly event. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.